on today's episode of the Mythic Masculine.
Masculinity globally is in a state of crisis today. And for a culture or an identity to go into crisis, it means that that identity is going to die and then be reborn. It's going through a transformational process of rebirth. When we look at the discourse, I know that you're deep in this as well, around what it means to be a man today. The picture of healthy masculinity that we could uplift, our culture doesn't have that picture in the discourse yet. So masculinity kind of needs to go through its own death and rebirth process, and this is the crisis that's presented collectively for us today.
What does it mean to be a man? And what kind of masculinity is needed to meet these uncertain times? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential threat, how can we draw upon the rich lineage of mythopoetics to navigate this terrain? I'm your host, Ian McKenzie, and together with an array of guests, we'll explore various pathways to realign masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. My guest today is Matt Sturm, a guide and writer dedicated to the evolution of masculinity. His offerings include psychotherapy, psychedelic-assisted work, sacred sexuality, and men's retreats. He is the author of 2 books, The Organic Masculine and Primal Drives, and the creator of the Living Cosmos Tarot deck. After a decade working in the corporate climate sector, Matt left his dream job to embark on a spiritual path that led him deep into yoga, tantra, and the mythic roots of masculine identity. His work bridges archetypal psychology, developmental theory, and sacred embodiment, inviting men into a more integrated and life-affirming expression of their power. In our conversation today, we explore the crisis and rebirth of masculinity in a time of global unraveling. Matt shares his framework of the organic masculine and how the primal drives of aggression and sexuality, when unintegrated, fuel much of the world's destruction. We look at the role of rites of passage, the death-rebirth journey of the hero, and the challenge of moving from domination to deep relationality. We discuss the symbolic power of myths like Hercules and the Hydra, the collective adolescent psyche behind our social and environmental collapse, and how reclaiming the warrior archetype could support a shift from violence to sacred protection. Together we ask, how might men transform their primal drives into devotion? What kind of masculine presence is needed to meet the polycrisis of our time? And how do we embrace the monster within so that it becomes an ally rather than an adversary? This episode is a call to enter the depths where masculinity is not conquered or discarded, but composted, reimagined, and reborn in service to life. A heads up before we begin, you're invited to check out my website, The Mythic Masculine, to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as how to become a paid supporter on Substack. This podcast is a true labor of love, and I have never accepted advertising. Instead, I rely on listeners like you to fund the show. If you found insight and solace from my conversations, please consider upgrading your membership. It really does keep me going. Visit themythicmasculine.com for more details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Matt Sturm. Welcome, Matt, to the show.
Thanks, Ian. Pleasure.
I'd love for you to share where you are in this moment, geographically, emotionally, spiritually, just to help attune the listener.
Mm-hmm. Well, physically, I'm in my temporary home in Mill Valley in Northern California, and I'm situated on a hill amongst the redwoods, which are incredible beings, and I'm looking out my office window, and it's a sunny, beautiful winter day, and we've been getting a bunch of rain recently, so it feels like fresh here. Emotionally, let's see. I'm feeling kind of attuning with the springtime, like new beginnings and new opportunities. I just published a book, and I'm super excited to be on this podcast. We've been chatting for a while, and so it just feels like some fresh newness here for me.
That sounds sweet. I look out my window. It's kind of gray, but we did have a good 2 weeks of just pristine blue sky, which is kind of rare actually for up in the Pacific Northwest at this time of year. So spring, though, still feels a little way off. But again, super grateful that we could circle up for this conversation. I could share a little about what seems to be the spirit of a shared inquiry that has brought us together in this theme of what is masculinity and how might we invite it, steward it, pollinate it into a more of a in service to life instead of what feels like deeply against it. And a particular article that you wrote, somewhat recent, that we're going to touch on is called Masculinity and the Polycrisis. And I think this will be a good way actually to just get into a lot of the different territory, the different threads that we do share a lot of commonality and wonder about. So let's just start there and see where we go.
Great.
So you wrote a piece, Masculinity and the Polycrisis. And so I'd love to hear a little bit of, again, what compelled you to write this piece and how to enter into that territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what compelled me to write this piece is, as you know, I've been going deep on the topic of masculinity for several years now. And I also have a passion for what's happening in the world, politically, economically, environmentally. And so I'm tracking the conversations, and one of the emerging ones is around either the meta-crisis or the polycrisis. And this is a perspective that kind of has emerged from the existential risk community, which says we can't just look at each of these crises that humanity is facing separately. We actually have to understand how they all weave together and look at them as a larger whole. But what inspired me to write this article is I've been following these conversations, and it's fascinating to me, but very focused on the externals, on our economic systems and those drivers, on our political systems and those drivers, on what's happening with the environment. But the conversation is not around our culture and our identity. And for me, they go together hand in hand. You have to understand.
And by identity, do you mean like gender identity of masculinity?
So masculinity, I think, is a very important piece of this. It's in our worldview, who I understand myself to be and who we as a culture, how we position ourselves within the greater reality. So identity in this case carries a lot of different contexts, but it's my interior psychological component that then interacts with my behavior and the social systems outside. So my inspiration was there's so much conversation around our systems and what happens physically and materially in the world. There's not so much discourse on who we believe ourselves to be and how that relates to the ways that humanity is operating in the world.
I'd love to have some clarity as well when you say we, right? Because we can mean a lot of things. And do we mean we, dominant North American culture? Do we mean we humans, biped humans as a whole? I'd love to get a little more clarity there when you speak from that we.
Absolutely. Culture, and I would say like the hermeneutic circle of us, is the belongingness in a group, and it operates across many different layers and levels. So when I'm saying we right now, I'm talking about you, me, and our audience kind of together specifically. And I have kind of a sense for the folks who are tuning into your podcast because I've been listening to all the great episodes. But also we is humanity as a globalized civilization. We are all interconnected. And so there are shared identities, and I would say masculinity is one of those shared identities that goes through all cultures, through all populations.
Well, this is great actually, because this actually helps have a few extra points of, I feel like, the foundational argument that you're making. And I just want to point out that this idea that the polycrises, the meta-crisis, essentially for folks listening, if you understand like shit's going haywire, in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways, then you maybe you have a sense that, again, something's different than maybe it's been in the past. Like there seems to be a multifaceted, intercomplex something happening, right? That everybody senses that there's something's deeply wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unfolding here. And what you've done is you've bound this conversation to our conceptions or understandings of masculinity as it relates to, and in fact, is perhaps a causal function or consequence of this polycrisis. And for me, I just want to point out as well, that's kind of how I came to focus on masculinity as well. That I spent 20 years or so as a filmmaker, and I've actually tracked largely through social movements like Occupy, looking at mythology and even the feminine as well. Like how do we make that visible? Understand what is the rise of the feminine? And finally to the Village of Lovers, which was this community in Portugal called Tamara. And for me, again, I guess I had a similar sense of kind of swimming upstream of like, how did we get here? Like what is causing this? And realizing that somehow masculinity is a really big part of it. And so I just wanted to affirm that this is an understanding that you're bringing that links, right? Like you can't understand the meta crisis or the polycrisis without understanding the crisis of masculinity. That's what I'm interpreting.
I agree. And that's my point as well. And it's one of the reasons I was super excited to have this conversation with you, because I know some of your background, and I think that you probably have a lot to contribute here as well. So then the next piece that opened up for me in this article is another passion that you and I share, which is mythology. So I don't know how I came to this, but somewhere in my psyche, it landed that the myth of Hercules and the Hydra was a beautiful symbol for this situation that we find ourselves in today. So maybe we can just start with a little overview of what that myth entails. So Hercules is the classic strongman hero. In the myth, he goes berserk and he kills a bunch of people, including his wife and kids. In some attributions, it's because the jealous wife, Hera, drives him crazy. But anyway, he needs to atone for the violence and the destruction that he has caused. And so they say, we're going to send you to one of your rivals, and he's going to give you 10 tasks, 10 labors for you to complete. And once you do all of this, you will be atoned for your sins, basically. So the second labor is to go defeat the Lernaean Hydra. So Lernaea is the name of a swamp. And the Hydra is this mythical beast, snake-like, dragon-like beast, which has 9 heads. And 8 of the heads are mortal, but the 9th head is immortal. And it breathes out this caustic, poisonous breath. And its blood is also poisonous. It's acidic. It'll burn through anything. So Hercules begins to engage with the Hydra. And when he chops off a head, 2 heads sprout in its place. And so the more he fights it, the bigger it gets. Also, it starts to wrap its tail and its tentacles around him and draw him in. So eventually what happens is Hercules with his trusty mate, Aeolus, work together, and whenever Hercules chops off one head, Aeolus uses a torch to cauterize the stump. And they get it all the way down to 1 head, and that last head is immortal. So he chops it off, and he pins it under a large rock, and there it stays forevermore. And he defeats the Hydra. So that's the foundation of the myth. But then as I dug further in, the story continues with Hercules. He takes some of the Hydra's blood and he dips it on his arrows. And it's poisonous, caustic blood. And he uses it in other adventures to defeat other monsters. But eventually, this blood ends up killing him, which is fascinating for me. Is as the story goes, there is a centaur who is making amorous advances on his wife, and Hercules gets jealous, so he shoots the centaur and kills him with the arrow. But before the centaur dies, he takes off his blood-soaked tunic and he gives it to Hercules' wife, and he says, "Give this to Hercules as a gift," kind of out of spite, in revenge. And when Hercules eventually puts it on, that caustic blood boils through his flesh and he dies. The mortal part of him dies, and then he's raised up to Mount Olympus, up to heaven by Zeus. So Hercules kills the Hydra, and the Hydra eventually kills Hercules. But neither of them can truly die because they are these immortal symbols that live with us kind of forever. One of them ends up pinned under a rock, and the other one ends up in heaven. So this is the myth that I use to connect. I think it's fascinating with our situation today.
Well, thanks for that. I haven't actually heard the fullness of that myth, and I think it is apt to look at the multiplicity of the crises that are present and see how they seem to sprout new challenges every time there's an attempt to solve one, right? Whether talking about climate chaos or social breakdown or the economy, it seems like the level of complexity that is unleashed seems to stymie any true attempts at like control.
Yep.
I think it was Daniel Schmachtenberger who spoke about the difference between, I don't know if it was like complex and comprehensive systems. I have to double check that. But basically, that the way that you engage with a complex system is very different than how you would engage with the other kind of system. And so, I mean, you spoke about this idea of systems level thinking in the piece. And perhaps this could be a good time to understand for folks listening, how do you engage at a systems level? And why is it actually so important to understand how to actually navigate these times?
Sure. Great. So segue into systems thinking. This is like another total wormhole that we can go down if we want. The shift is to understand that there is a collection, an entity that functions as a whole that cannot be understood by looking at the component parts alone. So our atmosphere is one of my favorite examples. You cannot understand the weather by tracking temperature gradients across the whole atmosphere. What we have to do is take a statistical, fuzzy, numerical approach to create these forecasts. And we can get a sense, we can get a range for what the weather is going to turn into, but we can't solve it and tell you numerically this is the answer. So systems are these entities where there's an organizing pattern which is larger than the sum of the parts. And so we have to look at the system as a whole in order to understand the behavior of this phenomenon. So what we mean by crisis, I actually think it's very important to define this term because there's a lot of meanings that kind of just get assumed out there. My meaning for crisis is a point of transformational change for an entity. Crisis is where there's a one-way transition from one state to another state that's not easily reversible. Oftentimes we think of crisis as something bad or some kind of death or destruction. This definition kind of points to a larger context of the way that entities change over time. We go through these metamorphoses, like the caterpillar goes through a crisis in order to become a butterfly. On a systems level, the system is defined by the organizing pattern, by the process that the system goes through. When the pattern gets disrupted, then the system enters a crisis and it can go into a state of disequilibrium, and maybe it will fall back or maybe it will find a new equilibrium point. But for a system, when the pattern goes into rapid fluctuation or change, that is a crisis. And that's what we see when we look at a lot of our ecosystems today and biodiversity. We're in a period of rapid change where we had a stable point and now things are shifting a lot. We don't know where it's going to go next.
I appreciate that definition of crisis. And I actually wonder, could you speak about a moment of crisis in your own life and how that was actually part of the transition moment in your own path into, a next phase of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually used to work, I had a whole career in the corporate arena on climate change. And I worked in solar energy. I worked for the public utility company here in California. And then I got to the point where I started to realize that in order for us to make meaningful change on climate change to address this issue, that it was not going to happen within the corporate sector like I had originally thought. We could use business, the power of business, to solve this issue. I started to realize that climate change was as much a spiritual problem as it is an economic or a policy problem. And my own internal state, I got to the point I was like 29 where I needed to do some internal work. So I quit my corporate job. It was my dream job. It was what I had been working for years to get to. I quit and I took a year to go travel and volunteer through Asia. And that is, for me, one of a few crisis moments that I've traversed as an adult, where my living situation, my job, my relationship, everything about my life just kind of changed. And I stepped into a period of, okay, blank slate. What wants to happen next? Who do I want to become? And kind of as a happy accident, I ended up at a yoga and tantric school in Thailand that got me set on my spiritual path. It got me connected to that something larger in life that I was looking for, but didn't actually know what it was yet. And that really set the course for the next decade of my life. So,
One of the key points you make in the essay is this understanding that there's not really one shared understanding of what a crisis is. That the quote you give is something like, the frame of reference that someone carries will inform how they understand why a crisis is happening. What are the forces at work, and possibly even how they might approach to fix it, right? Or to change it. And that struck me as really interesting actually at the time we're in, because if we talk about the meta-crisis, the polycrisis, and all these factors, it feels like there's different realities out there, right? That if you look at a sort of progressive left position, which again has gone through a lot of wonky kind of reformations in a way, but you might understand, what's going on. But if you're at it from like an alt-right perspective and you're looking at the collective crises, you have a very different understanding of what's going on. And so I don't want to get into like deep political discussion now, but it's very interesting to me that, you could see what's going on with Trump and the bulldozer he's running through the American government. And some people are cheering it on and saying, yes, finally, this is what we've needed. And others are like terrified and saying, this is a fascist coup. We have to stop it. And so again, that just goes to show how different people understand what's happening based on their perspective. And so again, I wonder if you might just unpack that a little bit more, not so much the content, but more of how that plays into how we understand, again, even how to navigate a complex Hydra time.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I guess broadly speaking, so I'm using the term polycrisis. So broadly speaking, the polycrisis is way bigger than any of us can understand, than any individual can wrap their head around. It includes material production, it includes supply chain, it includes energy, it includes bond notes. There's so many factors that play into this. Each of us is going to touch a few pieces of it. And based on what we're able to see and relate to, we're going to form our own conception of what this thing is. And that's colored by my values and beliefs, by my politics. It's colored by who in the media I'm listening to or following or reading. And so there is no singular definition or encapsulation that we can say, this is the meta-crisis. And that's part of the challenge, is that it's so big and so complicated that there's not a singular definition. And because it defies a singular definition, it also defies a singular solution. You can't say this is the one thing we need to do in order to address this.
So that being said, it's interesting that you've been drawn to look at the role of masculinity. And I think now it's maybe helpful to unpack that and to say, from this understanding or from how you approach, what is masculinity to you and how is it related to the polycrises?
Great. Masculinity for me is something that is one of my favorite topics, where I've started exploring it a decade ago and I just keep going deeper in. where I'm at with it right now is I see masculinity as a morphic field, which is a term from Rupert Sheldrake, which basically means a pattern of influence throughout the cosmos. And this pattern of influence percolates through all the different layers and levels of reality. So, masculinity for me is a socially constructed identity and gender that's within the context of whatever your culture is. And there are many masculinities out there. But that's not all that masculinity is for me. Masculinity is also a universal symbol or an archetype. And I see it as one of the grooves of meaning in consciousness that evolved together with mammals and humanity. And Carl Jung, his recognition was that the same symbols keep coming up again and again through different people's dreams and different cultures. And these symbols also show up in our religions and our myths. So there seems to be a universal quality to them, this collective unconscious that every human can kind of tap into. Masculinity is one of those. It's a universal symbol. So it gives us meaning and it colors our behavior and who we think we are. So it's not just a social construct, but it is a social construct in addition to a symbol and a myth.
I'd love to name here, and it's helpful for me and helpful for the listener, likely, who's wondering that how this kind of conversation often gets shipwrecked very quickly on this idea of binary thinking, right? Either or. Like, is gender only a social construct, and therefore it can be, demolished or performed any way you want? And or the other side saying that no, it's biology, it's set in stone, and that's what it is. And that's the level often it seems that the sort of general conversation, right, is around these things. And so what I like what you've done is you've added these other, I don't know if you call them quadrants or layers, right? You've spoken about it in one of your books, Organic Masculine and others, but that there's this multi-layered approach which allows like multiple understandings to be true at the same time without conflicting. And that to me feels very important. And again, maybe you might want to just spend a little bit more time here on talking about those different layers.
Sure.
But I think that's super helpful for the listeners as we move forward in this conversation.
Yeah. This understanding really unlocked a lot for me around gender because I spent a good deal of time thinking that masculinity was just a social construct, that it was constructed poorly, and we just need to either get rid of it or fix it, right? Having the broader view actually gave me more tools to start to engage with masculinity, and it helped me unlock pieces within myself. So the different layers or levels, at the core level, the physical manifestation of our being is our biology. So maleness, it doesn't have a singular definition, but there is a pattern of influence that includes our chromosomes and genes, it includes our hormones, it includes our body structure, and our reproductive organs, right? Broadly, we can say, okay, that's kind of in the realm of maleness. One of the places where where this conversation also kind of gets stuck is there's not a specific definition. So, for example, let's say I only have one testicle. Does that make me not a male, right? Do you have to have two testicles in order to be a male? For me, there's an organizing pattern, and it's not important to say binary wise, you're in or you're out. It's more to recognize, okay, you're kind of in this realm. There also, from my perspective, I'll just add here that I see three gendered archetypes very broadly: the masculine, the feminine, and the androgen. The androgen being both masculine and feminine, neither masculine nor feminine, or third gender, something different altogether. And the reason why I landed on this was I was looking at the myths and symbols. So I don't want to get too far off there, but anyway, so we have our physiology that's kind of at the gross physical level. We have our identities and relational expressions. So gender, masculine gender, my gender identity is who I believe myself to be. And my gender expression is how that is held relationally within our culture. And so this is more on the meaning making and identity level of how humans interact. And then the third level is the archetypes, which are these universal symbols. And the archetypes color the other two because our myths and our meaning come from these symbols. And so when you put all of them together, I say there's one big morphic field, one big pattern of influence that ripples all the way through the universe.
And then how does that relate to the polycrisis in the sense that how is masculinity's role, at least as it's broadly been operating? You speak that masculinity itself is in crisis and like related to this crisis. And so that's what I'd love to hear now, how you relate these things, right? Just as Hercules and the Hydra.
So now we're getting to the juicy part. This is the good stuff. So let's just name a few of the common elements about the crisis or the meta crisis, like the subcomponents. We have climate change. We have biodiversity loss and our extinction rate. We have economic inequality. We have geopolitics, energy, how we're using the Earth's materials and our supply chain. So for all of these that I just named, the inquiry is, how are they affected by men and the versions of masculinity that men are carrying? And for me, it was
All of
pretty
them.
stark. Yeah, all of them directly and big time, right? And so if we want to understand the impact that our systems are making in the world, we need to understand also the identities, values, beliefs, culture around masculinity that is informing the men who are holding the power and making these decisions.
Maybe just to name as well, one that you mentioned in the article, but not here, was AI also, right? And how I understand, by far the engineers around AI are men. This is something Joshua Schrei, I think, covered as well in his excellent episode on AI called So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in an Age of Mythic Powers, that he spoke about, again, men and their participation in the generation of AI. And then I also want to say there's, of course, Trump and Vance. I think Vance was in Europe and he was telling Europe, like, we can't halt this thing at all. Like, we need to say, no, nothing hold us back. AI needs to be full steam ahead. And so there is a deep relationship between these things. It's so obvious once you're willing to see it, that masculinity's role in actually putting forth or upholding these approaches, right, to these systems. Bitcoin, blockchain, all that stuff, of course, too, in the realm of this like abstract economic fantasy land, right? That is such a realm of construct and information and data, but seems to be deeply inhabited by men.
Right. So the term that I use for this is hegemonic masculinity. It's the form of masculinity that is wielding social power in our world. And that hugely impacts the functions of our global ecosystem today. But the other piece is that our institutions are then creating the versions of masculinity that are then being presented in our world leaders. So our schools, our military, our businesses, our political institutions are forming the future leaders and the types of masculinity that they hold. So it goes in both directions. The next point that goes with that is that it's not only the case that our environment is in crisis or that our economic system is in crisis. It's also the case that masculinity globally is in a state of crisis today. And for a culture or an identity to go into crisis, it means that identity is going to die and then be reborn. It's going through a transformational process of rebirth. When we look at the discourse, I know that you're deep in this as well, around what it means to be a man today. And in particular, the picture of healthy masculinity that we could uplift. Our culture doesn't have that picture in the discourse yet. I know that you're one of the people who are holding that and bringing it forth, like the next version. So masculinity kind of needs to go through its own death and rebirth process. And this is the crisis that's presented collectively for us today.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating piece that struck me as well when you wrote that, because you also link it to the lack of initiatory rites, right? Which is also, of course, how a man matures psychologically through these archetypal layers from boy to hero to man, I think /father, you talk about it in yours, and then to elder. And that if a culture does away or forgets initiatory rites, then you have a populace which is stuck at a certain adolescent level of psychological maturity, which, you don't have to wonder about what would that look like. That is what we have by and large in the dominant West, especially. And so that's how you can look to, these leaders in seats of power, or even, for example, Elon Musk. And Sam Harris, had a philosopher, had some piece he wrote somewhat recently about Elon, because they used to be, I guess, closer. And, he just shared about how dismayed he was about where Elon's gone. But he just made a good point of saying, here's a guy who's basically on his way to becoming a trillionaire, the first trillionaire ever on the planet. And the way that he conducts himself or like uses social media feels like a 12-year-old. Right. The way that he's just sort of spitting out, insults and blanket statements. And like, it's embarrassing on the one hand and terrifying on the other, that a man would have this much power and influence, but psychologically, at least, or perhaps even emotionally, I mean, he's clearly a brilliant fellow in a lot of other realms. But in terms of like emotional maturity and attunement to deep relational wisdom and repair, that doesn't seem to be the case. And so again, there's reasons for this. It's because, by and large, culturally, we don't have these rites of passage. So you make a statement saying that, like, in the absence of that, eventually, in the same drive, maybe we'd call this like the erotic intelligence of life or something, that the same sort of intelligence of that is actually to ride that into a death cycle, to still trigger a possibility of renewal. And again, maybe that makes the most sense when you look out and see, like, how could the culture and late stage capitalism and all that be driving off a cliff headlong, until you see it from that lens. Like, it's not a conscious process, it's actually an unconscious process, I understand from what you're saying. Yep. So that tends to make sense. So yeah, I'd love for you to speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah. That drive towards death, I would call it thanatos. It's when we get stuck and there's not a healthy progression forward because we don't have that rite of passage, then we drive towards death. And I would say, my purpose in sharing this interview with you is not that I think the world leaders will hear this and go like, oh, I need to go to a men's retreat and get my rite of passage. But we're all in this together. And to the extent that each of us as individuals and us in our smaller communities undertake these rites of passage into true archetypal adulthood, then we're not unconsciously supporting the dysfunctional system. We're actually starting to draw the center of gravity away from that adolescent pathological expression.
So with this in mind, as you've advocated for a reclamation of initiatory rites, as well as understanding and depiction of healthy expression, I might say, of the quadrants of archetypal masculinity, that many listeners probably have heard on this podcast, or of course read the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Douglas Gillett and Robert Moore. It's sort of a foundational text within the mythopoetic masculinity scene. But you, along the way, based on, it sounds like this understanding, right, of wait a second, what would a healthier masculinity look like, as you've named it, the organic masculine look like? You began writing these books, these lore books, to properly engage with the healthy models of these archetypes. First one was the magician. Second one, which is recently published, as you named, Primal Drives. And I feel perhaps in this part of the conversation, we could speak a bit about how does your book, Primal Drives, address coming back into right relationship with these factors, these drives of masculinity that often cause so much mayhem.
Love this. Right. So broadly speaking, I hold that I live in a sacred cosmos, that this creation is ultimately precious and good, sacred. And if I believe that the core fabric of all manifestation is sacred, then there needs to be a way to understand masculinity as sacred as well. But we can't just bypass and say, okay, the masculine is sacred, without acknowledging all of the pain that men and these pathological versions of masculinity are causing. There needs to be a large enough view to account for the dysfunction within the larger sacred holding. So the sacred masculine, my word for this is the organic masculine. I know that you use the term regenerative masculine. I feel very aligned with that term as well, but it's basically the natural, innate drive for life to support life and to flourish. And masculinity is one aspect of how that happens or can be. So, how do we get off track? Well, my current book that I just published is called Primal Drives, and it's focused on the archetype of the warrior. The title Primal Drives refers to these core, strong, instinctual aspects of being a man, namely aggression and sex. When we don't integrate them, they rule us and they drive a whole host of destructive behaviors. Part of my challenge in writing this book is I sat down to write a book about the warrior and I said, how can I positively portray the male warrior given all of the harm that's out there? And that was part of my process, is trying to understand, where does this all come from and how do we hold it? So we have these drives for sex and aggression, and these are amazing, beautiful qualities of humanity that source back through our evolution, and we can't get rid of them even if we wanted to. So the job of the archetypal warrior is to learn how to work with them, to learn how to harness them for generative, life-affirming purposes. And that's a big focus of my book, is getting in touch with our sexuality and getting in touch with that aggressive energy, and then finding a healthy way to bring it out into the world. And when that does integrate, then we actually start harnessing that force for an incredible amount of action to make the world a better place, which is what we really need as men to step into.
This reminds me of a similar challenge that Robert Bly had when he wrote Iron John, which is, again, one of the foundational books of the mythopoetic men's movement, which spoke a lot about the reclamation of the warrior. Because of different feminist groups and critics would point out and say, oh, this is just upholding an idea that the warrior is great, and there isn't any shadow, and seeing, not speaking to all the carnage and war and things like that have been going on. And I think he was speaking, again, he was making a call for a similar stance of this right reclamation of the warrior, because, like you're saying, it's not something that can just be stamped out or bypassed. That energy goes somewhere. And there's also now like a cliche, of course, around the the nice guy, right? And this idea that a feminist man somehow is like able to repress those primal drives, right, and kind of stamp out the toxic masculinity within him, and show up as a great ally and friend of women, and there's something incomplete about that, which again is part of what's come to light now, is that oftentimes I've even heard this phrase, something like, it's like the nice guys get to watch the most, as in it can be the most dangerous because they are most disconnected from the recognition that those forces live within them. And so they'll act themselves out in shadow ways regardless. And so again, the right reclamation of these energies is vital to actually putting them in service, like you said, in a meaningful way rather than in a destructive way.
I love it. And this is actually a topic that I go into with Bly and Iron John in the first chapter of this book. So the nice guy, Bell Hooks calls them overcooked broccoli, which I love that term. And I equate that with the sense of pacifism, which is, we're just going to avoid conflict, right? That's not the way through. Because as you said, this lives within us. So the warrior is a universal symbol. We cannot just try to get rid of him. He's already inside of all of us. The drives for aggression and sexuality are already inside of all of us. So the pathway through is to connect with, reclaim, feel, become intimate with these aspects of ourselves. And then the next step that I offer is to step into nonviolence, or ahimsa. And that the only trustable way to stand in nonviolence is by coming to terms with my own capacity for violence. that whatever horrors I see in the world, I have the potential to do that as well. And in that recognition, I can no longer point the finger at people and say, you're awful, you're bad, you're evil, you're wrong, because I know that that also could be me. From that place, I can then step into compassion and the capacity to meet someone else's violence with nonviolence. And this is where I think we need to get to with the warrior. It's one of the primary things that I hope to deliver through the message of this book.
I also see in this the more of a kind of classic or traditional understanding of masculinity, more generally in line with the right-wing conservative crowd of the masculine figure as a protector. And, I got to protect my family, I got to protect my land. And there's a certain pride in that, right? And that's often, particularly for Americans, I think, in this, right to bear arms and all this kind of stuff, right? It's much more of the mythos, it seems, in the American psyche. And you make this case of this transition, actually, like you don't denigrate that as a value, right? Of a man wanting to protect his family, protect his kids. But then you also say there's this possibility of then widening the aperture and understanding, that life itself needs our protection, needs our warriorship to show up for communities of the oppressed. And, and it's kind of interesting to me that also in a kind of distortion that the social justice warrior might have been popular from maybe Jordan Peterson, actually, right? Kind of critiquing this idea of a kind of, a hippie woke leftist or something that doesn't fully understand what's going on in the world and wants to fix things but can't clean their room. Like there's this kind of trope that has emerged, right? Of this idea that if you care about more than just simply your own family, that somehow you're, social justice warrior. But there's actually something deeply necessary about that, again, widening the scope, the horizon of actually what requires our care and our warriorship for these times. It's not pacifism, as you say. And so I'd love for you to speak a little bit of what does that mean to be like non-violently engaged in the troubles of the time.
Beautiful. So I see masculinity and also humanity on a developmental journey. And for this, I draw from integral theory, as well as developmental psychology. And there's like an appropriate place as we learn and grow to protect our tribe, to protect our people. And eventually, when we have enough support and resource and encouragement, we can then start to step a little bit beyond that to like a universal morality where we see that there's inherent dignity in every human. Every human has the right to life, liberty, and happiness, something like that. And then if we continue to grow and develop, we might see that actually just these universal rights are not enough, that there are specific categories of people that need even more protection because they're disadvantaged within the social system. So for example, children, people with disabilities need extra layers of protection in order to support them to be the most that they can be. And then eventually we start to step into an even broader moral disposition where we see that any harm that I inflict on another ultimately harms myself and harms the whole system, the relational system that we exist within. And I draw on Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King, who were really nonviolent warriors for the sake of peace. And the action there, where we end up, is aligning to what's true, being willing to suffer the harm of injustice in order to bring it to light and to open the hearts of all parties involved so that we can remember our shared humanity. And this is I call it the peacemaker, who's like the transcendent version of the warrior. So warrior still kind of has the word war baked into it. Where we eventually want to get to is through nonviolence, being really fierce agents for living in the equitable, peaceful world that is possible for humans.
Reminds me of a conversation a few episodes back with a friend, Gabriel Meyer, who's a deep peace activist, musician. I've done a lot of work with Israeli Palestinians. And one of the phrases he uses, he says, it's very easy to start a fight, but it takes a lot of courage to stop a fight, right? To actually, as an active thing, right? To get in there and make peace as a skill, right? And so, yeah, I appreciate that understanding. And it makes me now wind back to the myth of Hercules and the Hydra. And how does that inform, or how has that myth informed you in terms of the possibilities of moving beyond essentially a kind of co-demise, right? If that's what the myth was maybe initially saying, or maybe it's saying something else now to you.
Co-demise. Yeah, I like that term. At the very end of where I ended my story is we have separation and disempowerment. Neither one is like actively creating in the world. Neither one, the Hydra or Hercules, is in relationship with each other. And we can see this as the masculine and the feminine, or as order and chaos, or civilization and the natural world. There's many interpretations that are possible. When the two of them start fighting, the Hydra wraps its tail around Hercules. And in my kind of re-envisioning, we can look at them as one giant meta-crisis, where masculinity is in crisis, our natural systems and social systems are in crisis, but then all of them together, it's kind of one big clusterfuck. And from that perspective, we as men trying to defeat the meta crisis in the world is not the solution. The more we fight, the more we disconnect, the more we get stuck, the more heads pop up. That's not it. What we actually need is an embrace. We need an embrace of the unhealthy versions of masculinity in order to heal them and bring them closer towards wholeness. We need an embrace of the natural world and those who are disadvantaged and feeling the worst impacts of our social system. And, mythologically, it's when the strong hero embraces the horrible monster that they start to see beyond these polarized terms and can come into true relationship with each other. And so that's my hope and my rewrite or reframe of where we could go.
This strikes me as somewhat similar to the outcome of Moana, the film. I haven't seen the second one yet, so I don't know what happens in the second one.
I haven't
But
either.
the first one, okay, have you seen the first one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in the first one, of course, not to spoil anything with the listener, but there's the goddess is essentially pillaged by Maui, and there's this kind of demon protector that rises. I think Tafiti, I think her name might be, and essentially the whole finale of the film is recognizing that this protector goddess is not actually like a demon protecting the goddess. It's actually the goddess who's been wronged and turned into this monster by the hero actually transgressing and stealing her sacred heart. So there's definitely mythological implications there. But the outcome of that is not to defeat the monster. It's actually for Moana to return the heart to the goddess and make contact with her. And in some ways, it feels like similar to an energy of embrace to make contact. And that actually is what melts the aggression and the kind of trance possession that the goddess was under to come back to her richness and her fullness. Now, I see that as a bit of almost like a heroine's journey, or at least that I'm not just because it's a woman, in this case, Moana. And I see that there's something else you might be speaking to around what does masculine embrace look like in this context?
Mm-hmm. So on the hero's journey, which is the initiatory process, the hero gets stripped away from all the vestiges of regular life, all the weapons and armor, to become a very humble human being. And the hero then sees the vast powers that are at play, way vaster than my egoic self, submits and surrenders, and goes through a death and rebirth process. And this is what masculinity needs. And in that process, we come into a place of greater empowerment, greater integration, and more responsibility for how we show up in the world. In addition, traditionally, in this process, the hero becomes reborn, but also he enacts the eternal return. He touches the world tree, the axis of the world, and reenacts the creation story of the cosmos, so that, behold, I make all things new, right? And so the hero has to die and be reborn. And through that process, the natural world, or the universe, is also refreshed and reborn. And so they both go down and then come back up, blossom together. And this is what I think masculinity on the one hand, and our globalized institutions and economic superorganism need to go through on the other hand.
There's so many threads that also I feel speak to this. I mean, have you seen the film The Fountain? With,
I haven't.
I think it was Hugh Jackman. Oh man, you gotta watch that film. Very much speaks to exactly what you're talking about, and I won't spoil it. And the listeners as well, if you haven't seen The Fountain, my goodness, it's Darren Aronofsky, right? It's one of his excellent films. But also this understanding of, again, going back to initiation, the process of initiation, that there is a willing sacrifice, as you've named, within this transition, and that initiation so much is that. If we're talking about the rite of passage from adolescent to adulthood, psychological adulthood, and not going through this process, the consequence, I guess, egoically, you might say, right, psychologically, is that you get locked in, and a man gets locked into this sense of, one, utter death phobia that masquerades as ambition, right, and flight. And for me, this is also how you can explain things like the drive for transhumanist, live forever kind of mentality, right? That there's this idea, I need to persist forever, right? Whether it's like Ray Kurzweil, or I'm sure Musk, or these guys, and even the heading to Mars, again, right, as this flight from Earth, from composting, from the psychological death. And so these things are deeply interlinked, right? I think that if a man hasn't experienced this in some ritual fashion, hopefully earlier in their life, again, which was typical around late adolescence, I think, or like late teens, 15, 16, say, if they haven't experienced that ritual defeat, is what I might call it, right? Ritual defeat. And I'm thinking now of Rilke, right? To be defeated by ever greater foes, something like that. That grants something to a young boy in becoming a man, a kind of humility, right? That there's a bigger, the way I would describe it is that there's a bigger story out there, and that you are not the center of the story, but you're part of the story, right? And the consequence of not having that is, again, that the ego persists as the center of the story and enacts itself over and over and over again on everyone else, in our communities, in our relationships, on the planet. And there's no sign of abating in the sense until there's a more of like what you're speaking to, like the collective, like the Hydra has gotten so wrapped up and intertwined. It's like there's no escape, and both are going down.
Yep. Another term for this is the tyrant's holdfast. So the call for initiation comes. If we resist, we say, no. We hold fast to our comfort and our security and what we already have. We become tyrants. And collectively, I don't think it's a stretch to say that, dominant white male culture in the world is acting like a tyrant today. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. And we're talking about universal symbolic processes that happen on every layer and level of the cosmos. So at some point, we will go through this, and it's just a matter of how much bloodshed and destruction happens in the wake of it, or how much we are able to turn towards it and work together with this natural process.
And I think I'm hearkening back now to this understanding, and I believe it was my good brother Zamir said that something like a problem well understood is half solved, right? Something like that. And I think that's helpful in this understanding, right? Because if we don't have a grip on a certain frame, right, to understand what's happening, then it's easy to get lost in, the bad guys, or making others other, and misunderstanding or misappropriating what it means to be meaningfully engaged with these times.
Absolutely. So at the biggest level, we are one species living on one planet. And the more that we fight, the more that we enact different kinds of violence like social oppression or environmental violence, the more that we are hurting our collective selves. The more that we support each other and uplift each other, the more that we all rise together.
Well, sir, as we wind down our conversation here today, I just want to name once again your existing books that are out as of this recording is the lower book of The Magician, as well as now Primal Drives about the warrior, and anything you want to speak about these as well as the books to come.
Awesome. Thank you. So the first book is called The Organic Masculine on the Archetype of the Magician. And in that one, I go deep into consciousness studies. I look at all of this archetypal progression. I also go into integral theory and how we can understand the developmental journey of how we understand ourselves. This book that just came out, Primal Drives, is on the archetype of the warrior, where I go into the topic of male violence and sexual self-mastery for men. It's a big one. I loved writing it. I'm planning to do 2 more, one on the lover and one on the king. So to be determined when they come out. But it's very exciting for me to dive into this material because it feels so relevant for the larger world, but also for me personally in my life. I just love this stuff.
Well, brother, appreciate a fellow wanderer on this path together. And may we return again for conversations to come.
Thank you, Ian. Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you'd like to check out Matt Sturm's work, be sure to visit his website, mattsturm.com. That's MATTSTURM.com, as well as check out his Substack. He's got some amazing articles there. And of course, his books, The Organic Masculine and Primal Drives. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share the link on social media. It really does help me reach a wider audience. Thank you.